Good morning, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining the Boston University Institute for Global Sustainability for today's Research for People and Planet webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about promoting solar equity, residential photovoltaic adoption trends in New York State. I'm Cutler Cleveland. I'm a professor in the Department of Earth and Environment in the College of Arts and Sciences at Boston University, and an associate director for the Institute for Global Sustainability. Before we get started, I just want to encourage folks to visit the IGS website at bu.edu/IGS, where you'll find Boston University research spanning planetary and environmental health, climate governance, and sustainability transitions, as well as our work on energy systems of the future, all with the goal of advancing a sustainable and equitable future. A couple of quick housekeeping notes. The recording for today's webinar will be available on the IGS website and emailed to everyone who registered. To ask questions, please use the Q&A button at any point, and we'll get to as many of those questions as we can. And now let's turn things over to our presenters. Professor Robert Kaufman is part of IGS's core faculty and a longtime colleague of mine at Boston University in the Department of Earth and Environment. Robert's research ranges from land use strategies to oil markets to climate change, and he has extensive knowledge of a wide range of environmental and energy science and policy. Dr. Anita Tendler is an esteemed and recent Boston University alum in the Department of Earth and Environment, who earned her PhD in 2023, working with Robert on today's research for her dissertation. She is now at PA Consulting as a senior consultant in economics and investment strategy. So with that, I will turn things over to our distinguished presenters.
Well, let me thank everybody for taking the time to come see this work. Most of the credit goes to Anita. This was her dissertation, or one of the papers in her dissertation. And consistent with that, I'll just present a brief overview of the methodology, and then Anita will talk about the research results, which I'm sure is what interests most people. So, and I assume people can see the slides. So what Anita and I did was we used fairly interesting...
Hang on, Robert, we're not seeing slides yet.
We're not seeing slides yet. Okay. Why not? Okay. I've got to reshare my screen. Okay. How about now?
Yep, go into presentation mode.
Yeah. Okay. So what Anita and I did was we compiled a panel of data of over 25,000 installations of residential PV systems across New York State at the zip code level between 2011 and 2021. And we analyzed the relationship between the average price of the installation and capacity using a co-integrating relation, which gives us the long-term relation between prices and capacity. And then we also estimated error correction models, which give us the short-run relation between capacity, prices, incentives, electricity prices, and the rate at which capacity moves towards the equilibrium described in this section. These equations are estimating using fixed effects estimates, which mean they only capture relations over time within each zip code. But for this analysis, we're really interested in the variations across zip codes, and those effects are represented by the alpha and tau components. That is, each zip code has its own alpha and its own tau that tells us how quickly, or excuse me, how high the equilibrium level of capacity will be in that zip code, everything else being equal, or how quickly zip code I will add capacity, everything after accounting for all these variables. And so what we're going to do is we're going to use those alphas and taus as dependent variables in an equation that says the level of equilibrium capacity and the rate at which capacity is added varies across zip codes based upon 156 characteristics of those zip codes. And excuse me, sorry, I have COVID, so it's a good thing this is a remote seminar. So this is a list of 52 socioeconomic variables, and we put them in 4 general categories: economic factors, household characteristics, the built environment, and proxies for environmental justice. You can see them here. The question is, okay, we've got 52 variables here. How do we get to 156? The simple answer is each variable is represented in a linear term, a squared term, and a log version to allow for nonlinear relations between the alphas and taus and these various socioeconomic characteristics. The last innovative part of Anita's research was, how are we going to sort or choose among those 156 socioeconomic variables? 2 general procedures are available. These so-called ad hoc procedures, where you just sit down and you start adding and subtracting variables. And at some point, you just either A, get tired, or B, you decide, this is a model that I like. It has the variables I want in the model, and it has the signs I want. The problem is that leaves the results wide open to investigator bias. That is, you may have chosen the variables that generate the results you expected to see rather than the best statistical model. To alleviate those concerns, we used an objective procedure called the general to specific methodology, which uses a large number of statistical criteria to pick the model, or to pick the variables in the final version of the model. As such, we really have no control over what variables get chosen, other than choosing the significance level that gets users to choose that final model. And what I'm happy to say is, whether we use the 0.01, the 0.001, or the 0.0001 threshold, the model results are significant. So it doesn't look like the significance level or even the general Getz methodology generates idiosyncratic results. And so now I'd like to turn it over to Anita, who's going to talk about those non-idiosyncratic results.
Thanks so much, Robert. So when we're talking about movements towards equilibrium and the notion of equity in residential systems, we evaluated whether movements towards that equilibrium alleviate or exacerbate concerns about distributive energy justice. And that's the idea that the benefits of clean energy are equitably distributed, such that those who would benefit the most from clean energy gain access to it. And so traditionally speaking, there's a lot of literature out there that speaks to the fact that higher income households are more likely to be early adopters of residential solar systems. And that's kind of the story across the clean tech space, whether that be solar systems, electric vehicles, heat pumps, et cetera. And the notion is that once learning by doing by those early adopters is able to lower installed prices, it triggers social factors like peer effects and social norms to widespread adoption afterwards. And typically results suggest that race and or ethnicity are a large driver in determining who is an early adopter and who is a lagging adopter of residential systems. And we found that specifically between 2020 and 2021, installed capacity is in fact not equally distributed among zip codes in New York State, implying that certain zip codes have objectively installed more solar within that year than other zip codes. And similarly, zip codes are adjusting to different levels of equilibrium, or that they're investing at different rates across zip codes. And we actually find that income is one of the explaining factors to determine how fast zip codes are installing solar. So we find that zip codes with the largest proportion of LMI, or low to medium income households, are adjusting to an equilibrium level of installed capacity that is 1.14 kilowatts smaller than the wealthiest zip code. And typically a lot of, as Robert had discussed, a lot of research tends to use the ad hoc approach where they look at individual variables like income, race, and ethnicity as these predictive factors for what the installed capacity of solar would be within a given zip code or county, et cetera. And we actually find that using the GETS procedure, so this objective procedure across all 156 variables, that race and ethnicity alone, all else being equal, have little relation specifically with the equilibrium level for residential solar systems and their installation rates. And those individual variables across all of the socioeconomic variables we evaluated have a very small partial R squared. And these results are surprising, like I said, given the previous analyses of residential solar systems, which tend to emphasize the role that race and ethnicity play. And so considering the approach that we took in my research, we assume that investigator bias is partially responsible for the large effects that race and ethnicity play in previous studies. And this very narrow focus on individually deciding which deterministic variables you include in the analysis may reflect that investigator bias. And so given the expansive data set that we use, we assume that that the role of race and ethnicity are minor, because when you think of it realistically, minority groups such as minority groups tend to live in zip codes where economic conditions, the built environment, household characteristics, and other proxies for environmental justice influence that equilibrium level for solar and the rate of installation. So for instance, zip codes with the greatest concentration of benzene, which is a co-pollutant associated with vehicle exhaust and other power plant generation, installs 0.006 kilowatts per month less than zip codes with the lowest concentration. And a similar trend is seen in zip codes with the greatest traffic congestion. And so these unequal rates of monthly addition raise concerns for distributive energy justice, especially when considering the way in which specifically New York State distributes incentives through its declining block structure in the program called the New York Sun Megawatt Program. And so when you have a declining block structure such that earlier on in the incentive program, you distribute the largest amount of incentives, and as the state installs more, that incentive level declines. And so presumably, if higher income households are more likely to be early adopters, incentives, or the greatest value of incentives, will flow to zip codes with the largest equilibrium levels. And the spatial distribution of this equilibrium depends in part on those socioeconomic variables. And so the largest value incentives will also flow to those with the fastest rates of installation. And so if zip codes with the largest percentage of LMI and frontline communities have slower rates of investments, by the time they access incentives later on into the program, the incentives are either of much lesser value or just down to $0. Next slide, please. And so the skewed distribution of incentives indicates that a declining block structure at this large spatial scale, so in New York State, the incentives are just distributed either within, earlier on to the program, they were just throughout Long Island, New York City region, and then the upstate region. So there were just these three large geographic areas. And so when they're distributed at this large spatial scale, they do not meet the criteria for distributive energy justice because they accentuate that skewed distribution of incentives. And so the lack of incentives will slow the rate at which the lagging communities are able to catch up, because by the time they're applying for the dollar per kilowatt value, it's either very low or the incentive has been taken up by that block. And so again, this limits the degree to which LMI and environmental justice communities are exposed to solar systems, which will dampen the potential role of social factors like those peer effects. And one of the main takeaways of our research is a suggestion in ways to redefine the way that incentive structures are designed in order to alleviate the concerns that are associated with incentive distribution. So specifically focusing on looking at smaller geographic scales rather than those three large blocks in order to preserve financial support for zip codes that you can identify that invest slower, and reserving those incentives for environmental justice and or LMI communities would ensure that you enhance their installed capacity and therefore bolster the role that social factors play when it comes to their decision makings, whether or not to install solar. So that's a quick summary of the research that we did. I'm happy to pause there, turn it back to Cutler for a Q&A. I'm sure there are a lot of kind of pockets of information we weren't able to cover in our quick talk. So happy to speak to any given point if anyone's curious. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Anita and Robert. Very interesting and timely analysis. We have had some questions come in from our participants, so I will shoot a couple of those over for you and Robert to discuss. Someone asked, given your results regarding low-income solar, what can utility companies do to better promote and disperse and incentivize solar for these low-income households?
Yeah, so that's an incredible question, because when we're talking about the New York Sun incentive program, that is a program distributed by the state. So the NYSERDA distributes those incentives. But when you're installing solar, obviously having utility support is quintessential, because they will be the ones who are working with developers in interconnecting and permitting, and at the end of the day are the determinants for how much money, what the payback period will be for a solar system, which is really important for low to moderate income households. And that's a particularly timely question, because at least in California right now, they're talking about moving away, due to utility push, moving away from the traditional net metering, specifically in multifamily units. So enabling multifamily units to benefit from clean energy that's on site. So distributing the net metering credits and moving away from that to a system that's similar to New York State, the VDER. So it's value distributed energy resources, where it's mostly focusing on when the clean energy is exiting onto the grid and where. So that makes the amount of money that you get back for the exported energy vary based on time and place, rather than net metering, which is kind of just a price set by utilities. So my main takeaway is just ensuring utility support for potentially moving towards community solar, because like we had mentioned in New York State, well, one of the variables that we evaluated was kind of urban density and whether or not that plays a role in the amount of solar that's installed. And we actually found a negative relation between the more urban a zip code is and the equilibrium level that that zip code is adjusting to is lower. And that's just because of the inherent physical constraints of installing rooftop solar in somewhere like New York City, where there are only so many single family homes with the correct rooftop orientation, and houses tend to be older, et cetera. So there has been a very large transition to community solar through utility support, which will be an interesting challenge moving forward, because I know developers have some economic give or takes on whether or not they will break even on community solar. So I know that's a long-winded circular answer, but
Short
story is complicated.
Yeah. So someone asked a question about the in the econometric analysis and this intermingling between race and income and how you are able to distinguish or detail the relationship between race and income and their impact on solar panels. Can you speak a little bit more about that, either you and or Robert?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So I think the reason why, I mean, I highlighted those two variables in this very brief talk, but one of the main highlights I think of this research was the array of socioeconomic variables that we analyzed. So I used data that was compiled by New York State in accordance with the CLCPA. And so these were variables that were used as criteria to define essentially environmental justice or disadvantaged communities. And so the whole point was to expand beyond just those very obvious and blatant variables like median household income and race and or ethnicity. And so if you go to the slide that, or we don't have to, but in the overall scheme of what variables we look at, we're able to not only look at income, but also what the house value is, what the home energy affordability is, because income will is proportional, or the relative attractiveness of residential solar is not just based off of what your income, but also based off of what your energy bill is, which is relative to your location, depending on what your utility is and what percentage of your income you spend on your energy bill. So we look at factors like that, what percentage of your income is spent on rent, and then more on the like built environment and environmental justice side, we look at co-pollutants like benzene, particulate matter 2.5, traffic congestion, exposure to industrial land use. So we're able to disentangle those specific variables by looking at like 50 more, just to be able to really determine what are all of the factors that are playing into the real world view of why certain zip codes are installing more or less solar or installing faster.
Great. Okay. Thank you for that. Robert, do you want to add anything to that, or can we move on to another?
I move on to another one. I couldn't add anything meaningful to that.
So another question from one of our attendees is an additional consideration that could affect rooftop solar in dense urban areas is a competition for rooftop space for other uses, such as green roofs, rooftop gardens, and patios. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, that kind of is an additional explanation as to why residential solar is potentially limited in urban areas. I know at least the New York Sun program in its expansion is diminishing the amount of residential solar or incentives given to residential installations within the New York City area while ramping up the commercial side. So leaning more towards larger scale installations and moving away from incentivizing smaller installations in the city.
Okay. Another question, you mentioned payback period, and someone asked a question about that. And the specific question was, for a residential solar PV system in New York State, how does one actually go about calculating the payback period? We hear a lot about payback period, but it sounds intuitive, and I guess intuitively it is pretty simple, but it's not that easy. Am I right about that?
Yes, because it is very, well, I'll say it's twofold. One, it's very specific on where you are and what time you're able to export whatever excess electricity you generate on your individual rooftop back to the grid. So going to the where question, New York State specifically does, I think they, and I might not fully be accurate in this, but I believe they're actively transitioning away from net metering, which is the idea that if you have a solar panel on your house and you are making more electricity on that solar panel than you actually need within your house, you're able to export that electricity back to the grid. And essentially, you get credits on your utility bill for the amount that you sent out. And so, like the example I was given in California, the reason why the transition has begun in a lot of these more market mature states is that the nature of the way that solar works is the sun shines during the day. And so you develop what's called a duck curve. So you tend to make a lot more electricity when demand is pretty low, because demand tends to be in the morning and evening, but most of the electricity is generated during the day. And so realistically, you wouldn't be getting paid that much back because demand is pretty low for when you're sending electricity back onto the grid. So the transition away from net metering to the, to add to that, a large reason to transition away from net metering in states like California and New York State is also to incentivize battery storage. Because that would mean that if you are making a lot more solar energy during the day, you can save it in that battery and send it back to the grid when you know you'd get a better rate. And so the notion to move away from net metering to something to VETR, which is like a stacking value. And so that would be based off of much more locationally specifically where you are, like does that grid need electricity at that given time, what the grid makeup is at that time. I'm not well informed enough on VETR in order to speak to specifically what the dollar per kilowatt is, but all that to say is your payback period will entirely depend on where in New York State you are, who your utility is, whether you have battery storage or not, what the policy landscape is. And that's also assuming you did like an outright purchase on your solar system. So I know the traditional, at least in New York State, it's like 10 to 12 years, but that would vastly vary depending on also if you got like an upfront incentive, how much that diminished your kind of like sticker price, and then as well as what the policy landscape, how the policy landscape evolves as you have your solar system.
Yeah, I know we're about to run out of time, but I just want to add a couple of things very quickly. One is those zip code specific intercepts that we analyze, that would allow the return on investment to vary across space. And the other thing is Anita did for her dissertation a very important second paper where she showed that financial considerations such as return on investment for solar had a much smaller effect on installations than these social factors like social norms and alike. So I don't want to diminish return on investment, but consumers are utility maximizers, not profit maximizers. And most are not doing this very detailed return on investment calculation to drive their decisions to install solar.
Great. Thanks for that, Robert. And thanks, Anita, to you as well for really thought-provoking and on the cutting edge kind of research related to this. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the questions. There are a lot of questions were submitted, but we couldn't, time constraints didn't allow us to get to them. Reminder that go to bu.edu//IGS, where you'll be able to find more about the Institute. You'll also be able to find the link to the video of this webinar. And if you add another /IGS/events, you'll find out about all the other cool stuff that the people and programs at the Institute. And so with that, thank you everyone attending, and thanks again to our presenters today.
Thanks so much, Cutler.
Thank you very much.